You're behind some legislation right now that would use the tax code to combat climate change. What would this entail?
So this is the Energy Sector Innovation Tax Credit, and it's a cornerstone of what I think is the Republican response on climate change and the environment, and that's about unleashing innovation. It's about encouraging innovation, the next generation of technology when it comes to energy production. And at its core, this is about rewarding that innovation and encouraging that innovation as it comes into existence and then also becomes commercially viable. And so the Innovation Tax Credit is about that. It doesn't pick winners and losers out of Washington, D.C. It just says if you can show that you can produce energy more efficiently and cleaner, you get this tax credit. That encourages money to come to the table, and it stands with that technology as it goes from cradle into existence.
Am I right to assume then that you see climate change as a problem and that humans can influence it?
I do. I mean, I have have recognized that the climate's changing. I am one that recognizes humans have contributed to it. And then this is often where the debate then goes to. You know, did humans do it 100%? Right. And I pretty much let that argument go. It is what it is, and I do believe it's occurring, and I do believe you can find common ground on this issue when you talk about it correctly and when you focus on solutions that are actually going to solve the problem.
I do hear from people, though, who say, A, it's not changing, or it's changing, but the climate always changes. It's just the natural cycle. We don't have to do anything about it. And a lot of those folks are in your party. How do you talk with them about this? So
when I have that debate with folks that just don't see it that way, I say, well, do you agree that you want to support the environment? I have yet to see a Republican member or a Democratic member saying, I want to pollute the air, I want to pollute the water. Quite opposite. When you move to the conversation, well, you know, on this innovation tax credit, we're going to produce more efficient energy and it's going to be cleaner. Isn't that a good thing? And they're like, yeah, I support clean air, I support clean water. And so you can bring people together just on how you talk about it. So usually in those conversations, I focus more on the impact in a positive way to the environment from what I'm advocating for and supporting. And the innovation tax credit really can bring people together. And the other thing that I find with a lot of folks that are in that, when you talk about standing for people in this conversation and the innovation coming from entrepreneurs, American innovators. You know, a lot of folks in our party, rightfully, and I am one, who believe the solutions are going to come from people, not necessarily from government. There's a public-private partnership to this, obviously, because we're using the tax code as part of that public component of it. But, you know, this is something where you can bring people together if you focus on empowering people to help solve this problem.
I have to ask this, running for governor, I'm hearing rumors.
You know, this is something we're seriously taking a look at. This started a couple months ago with some articles that were out there in the public domain, and since then, I will tell you, people, and some very serious people that I respect greatly, have reached out and said, if you're serious about this, we are definitely interested, because I think there's commonality. And these aren't just Republicans, these are Democrats, and these are independents. They're concerned about one-party control in Albany right now, just dictating policies that are driven by extremism. And they want to stay here. They don't want to move. They don't want to go to Florida for 6 months and a day and go through all that hassle. This is their home. This is my home. And so, you know, we got plenty of time to make a final decision on it, but I'll just tell you, it is something that's on my mind as people approach me and have a conversation with me about it.
What particular issues do you think you'd focus on should you go down this road?
You know, I think the proper focus in Albany should be kind of the Charlie Baker. I'm getting to know Charlie Baker and Larry Hogan, two governors. Larry's from Maryland, Charlie Baker's from Massachusetts. And there's some of the most popular governors in the United States of America. And what they choose to focus on is how to bring people together, how to find common ground. And they focus more on the economic infrastructure, the jobs, the vibrancy of their state as the top priority. And that's what I would do. I think, you know, right now, if you can rebuild New York State from within, I will tell you, that will serve us well long term. So anything that focuses on opportunity, so people don't leave New York State, I would be taken that as the top priority.
There were some ethics concerns about the governor a few years ago. As you might remember, New York Times did a pretty big expose about the Moreland Commission, established by the governor in order to look into ethics complaints. And one particular inquiry was stopped by the governor as it appeared to get close to an organization or a business that was linked to him. And then he stopped the commission, he put the commission out of business, saying at the time, well, it had done its work by prompting statewide change. But then gubernatorial candidate from the Republican Party, Rob Astorino, was saying there might be a different motivation here. Do you have concerns about that?
You know, I'll defer to the governor in regards to answering those questions, but you've seen cases like the Buffalo Billion and very close aides that got tied up into things.
Right.
But I'm not going to weigh into that. What I'm more focused on as this debate and this conversation starts is, if we do this, what can we do to improve the state of New York and the impact on people on a day-to-day basis? And I will just tell you, obviously ethics is a concern, but I will tell you, when you talk to a lot of folks, when you talk to New York State residents and people of the 23rd Congressional District, they look at Albany and they look at Washington, D.C. and like, well, what are you doing there that's impacting me in a positive way? And obviously ethics have to be one of the top priorities, but as you focus on what you're going to do, what can you do to improve people's lives? That's what I would be choosing to focus on.
I hear that. At the same time, I hear them talk about corruption too.
Oh, absolutely.
It's in the diners.
And don't get me wrong. Corruption, absolutely needs to be held accountable, and that's why, you know, the governor has to answer for these questions. The governor has to answer for those, and you know, that's where I'll defer to that. And there's processes there. There's the Justice Department. There's prosecutors, and there's a whole slew of resources there to investigate that corruption. My look at this is more about what policies can you advocate first, and what can you do to change the culture of Albany right now. And the culture of Albany, to me, is overtaken by this extremism that we've seen on display in America, but now we got one-party control, no checks and balances in Albany that are promoting policies that are dangerous for New York State's future. Yeah,
I'm sorry to focus on the Moreland. I was just very involved when that was happening. We didn't really hear from anybody inside his circle to talk about why it was cut. Preet was investigating. That investigation ended pretty rapidly. Would you want to hear from people in his inner circle to know about motivation, whether it comes to the Buffalo Billion or the Moreland Commission?
Sure, and I think that those processes will take care of them themselves, and those questions will be asked. But you know, from my perspective, there are other resources, there are other tools to do that. You know, and I get people. Don't get me wrong, corruption is a serious thing. But it's just, I think people are getting sick and tired of just the status quo, and just it's just becoming the norm of Albany. It's got to change. And so, not saying we're making any final decisions, but we're taking a look at it because someone has to step up. And what I would encourage anybody who's interested in running, if you're interested in running, reach out to us. I mean, I'll support whoever the candidate is.
When you were on Chris Cuomo's show in November, he had asked you, do you think this is an impeachable offense? And you said no. He said, okay, but is it wrong? Is it wrong? I don't know if you remember that. He kept saying that, to which you eventually responded, what I see here is a legitimate basis of executive power in order to investigate corruption. Are you saying that the quid pro quo in this case, using taxpayer money, which you said, this is taxpayer money, in order to investigate corruption is constitutional because it's in the national interest? Is that basically what you were saying?
And it's within the domain of the executive branch. In order, the president, he or she, carries out the laws of Congress, and I recognize that the president should rightfully ask the question, if taxpayer dollars are going to go to a foreign country or a foreign entity or a foreign individual or a foreign corporation, as well as domestic, the question of corruption should always be on the mind of the executive branch. And what I see here is an exercise of that authority. And when you're talking about impeachment, having that narrative and that evidence out there, I think counters the grounds for impeachment.
Understood. So at this point, the evidence that you've seen, you see the withholding of aid in this case in order to procure an investigation that could help eliminate corruption.
Correct. I see what happened here, in my opinion, was there was indications of corruption. I don't think anyone disputes, any experts or other, that there's corruption in Ukraine,
Yeah.
that there are corrupt entities in Ukraine.
Correct, yeah.
And that's not limited to the Bidens and XYZ Corporation. It's there. And so as that money's flowing, taxpayer dollars flowing to that country, the question of corruption, I think, is a legitimate presidential prerogative and authority to ask.
Right. Do you think it would be unconstitutional if a president were to withhold aid for personal interests and this wasn't about corruption? Would that be an unconstitutional
So
act?
if and I hate to get into hypotheticals or speculate on certain fact patterns, but you know, when you look at the impeachment cases of Clinton and Nixon, one of the things that I saw distinguishing there into this hypothetical situation would be if, for example, a president of the United States was taking money, taxpayer dollars, and putting it in his or her own pocket when no rightful claim to that money could be exerted. Obviously, that is a very serious situation that could warrant impeachment. But that's not what occurred here. And in those hypothetical situations, the high crime standard has to be pretty substantial. And so when you're describing, as I hear it, is if a president takes taxpayer dollars and puts it in his or her own pocket, yeah, that would be a problem and would be open to impeachment claims.
Right. So when I read this Lawfare article with 3 legal scholars, they went back to Hamilton and the Founding Fathers, and their argument was that they had a broader definition of bribery, or what we're describing in this case, and they didn't specifically say money in the pocket. Their quote was, "An office holder's abuse of power of an office to obtain a private benefit rather than the public interest." So when you broaden it out like that, in this particular case, the accusation from the Democrats is that the private benefit would be to make re-election in 2020 easier. Do you see how a broader concept of bribery could fit this particular case?
Well, obviously, to the folks that support impeachment, who support that this is an appropriate removal of the President of the United States and President Trump, I understand their argument. I understand their position. I disagree with it. I don't interpret the evidence that way. I don't interpret what happened here the way that they do. But I understand their argument, and I acknowledge their position on the matter.
So what you're saying is, if indeed he was doing this in order to benefit his 2020 election, do you see that benefiting his private interest above public interest?
So take out, because what we're talking about here, just make sure we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So when you look at what Nixon did,
right,
and he wasn't impeached, but he was going down that path. He was breaking into an office and taking and stealing records for his own personal re-election efforts. Clearly, there was no legitimate government function. I could find none in the record when we looked at it. What was the government function of the President of the United States potentially ordering the break-in of their political adversary's office? Clearly none, in my opinion. Here, you don't have that situation in the sense of, even if that's what the motivation was, in part, was to get some type of political dirt or any of that nature, you still had the question of corruption, which I believe was the president's intent. What I believe the evidence shows is that corruption was motivating the request of looking into where our taxpayer dollars were going. And I think that's a legitimate presidential action and authority.
Are you saying that even if part of his motivation was for private interest, it's okay because it was either started because of corruption?
I appreciate the clarification. No, that's not it. I interpret the evidence as the motivation was corruption, to root out corruption and make sure taxpayer dollars were being...
Priority passengers are welcome to board this time. Thank you for your business and loyalty.
That's a different story.
So just so we're clear, I see the whole fact pattern of corruption being the motivation. I
100%
understand
corruption.
This is what was being pursued. That's what they were pursuing with the taxpayer dollars. I understand the position of the argument that people who support impeachment or removal of the president are indicating that this was not motivated by corruption. The only motivation here was political advantage and personal gain. I understand that. I disagree with it, but I'm acknowledging their position on the matter.
So are you saying then, because it's 100% corruption, constitutional falls within executive power?
Main cabin 2.
If it did have any degree of personal interest, would that be a problem?
Well, I think you're getting into a hypothetical and speculation that to go down that path, I think, would be misleading or irresponsible, because at the end of the day,
Right.
the presumption of innocence has to remain
True.
with the defendant. And the defendant here is the President of the United States. And if you take the totality of evidence that I have seen, I believe, in my informed judgment, personally, that corruption was the motivating factor. And I don't see that what level of proof, beyond a reasonable doubt, whatever standard you want to think of, where clearly this was all done for political purposes, therefore it's a high crime, and it warrants the removal of the president. That's why the founders always talked about this with high crimes as being the standard. Not technical violations of law, not political differences that you have with the president. These are crimes that, and I use treason often as the standard. I mean, they equated treason, that's a death penalty case. There's a reason why treason's in this standard.
So I'm going to argue slightly against the hypothetical. As opposed to hypothetical, this is a very real allegation that was brought to the floor. The fact that there was personal interest involved in this. And the reason why I think it's important to answer is because I'm thinking a lot of people want to know whether you'd be open to changing your position on this should the evidence lead you there. Right? So should the evidence lead you to believe that this is public interest, whether you would change your position?
Yeah. Well, obviously, new evidence that if they started impeachment all over again, which some in the Democratic Party have advocated to do, and go down other paths of impeachment, we'd have to deal with that situation at that given time. But from the evidence that was presented, and when we had to make the decision, we came to the conclusion we did. Now, obviously, you have a trial in the Senate that the senators get to make that determination, I guess, is where we would leave it. But the bottom line is, impeachment, boy, you go down this path, you better make sure that it is without a doubt a high crime, and it is treasonous. I mean, that's where Bill Clinton's lesson, that when we looked into Bill Clinton's impeachment, that was very educational to me. What was the legitimate government operation of the president in that situation? He's having sex with an intern in the Oval Office and lying about it. And even that, there's no legitimate government function there, even that wasn't subject to removal by the Senate. So to me, that is illustrative of how I look at this. These are very high crimes that the founder said, you know what, you can't wait even 3 years, 2 years, a year. You have to remove the president from that office.
Right. So am I reading you right, though, that you say you are open to evidence, should it appear, to change your position if they prove personal interest?
I wouldn't say that, because I don't have, I'm not going to be making that determination on this case. That's in front of the Senate now. But if there's a whole new articles of impeachment drawn up, and there's a whole new claim of nefarious action by any president, you got to be open to that.
Were you open to it leading into the impeachment?
I think I hope, and I'm very open.
Right.
I take my role as an elected official very seriously. Right. And so if, as we went through this process, I was open. I made some public comments about, okay, well, let's see what they have. But once they started, and once it became clear, and I think a lot of this, where we're at now, to be perfectly honest with you, stems from a miscalculation by some of the Democratic members who initiated this. I'm under the impression they never anticipated the president disclosing that transcript of the Ukrainian call. They were speculating. They were hearing different things, that they were going to drive this underground. And as we went through that process, and then the transcript came out, and the other issues came to light, we kept an open mind through the whole thing. And at the end of the day, I just do not see impeachable level offenses here.
So you are open to the possibility of seeing evidence that would have shown personal gain?
I think any elected official should be open when they commence any proceeding such as this to what's the argument, what is the evidence, and I believe, in my humble opinion, we demonstrated that from the get-go.
So if there was someone that could show motivation for personal gain, you would have wanted to hear from them?
Well, I would have liked to hear, if I had a chance to do over in the House of Representatives and I was leading the impeachment, I would have said we need to go through all these nooks and crannies
Right.
of every piece of evidence, and if executive privilege needs to be adjudicated by the judicial branch, if those issues, take your time and
Yeah.
go through this methodically and in an inclusive way. They chose not to do that.
Right. And I think part of the reason is, from what I understand, is that could get bogged down for so long. It could be used as a stalling tactic. But I don't disagree that I would love to see some adjudication on the executive privilege. Would you have liked to hear from Giuliani?
You know, that was not within my prerogative, without my authority. So I deal with the reality of what I was faced with. And they chose to go down this path. And what I saw, especially when I got the transcript like the rest of America did, I saw that there was not impeachable level offenses here.